In the late 19th century, a quiet ritual swept across the plains, promising the return of ancestors and a renewal of life, and it changed everything for the people who embraced it. The ghost dance offered hope to communities facing dispossession and hunger, but it also fed deep fears among settlers and officials who misread spiritual revival as political threat. In the next few minutes, we'll trace where the movement began, what the dance meant to those who practiced it, and how misunderstanding and power turned belief into a catalyst for suppression and tragedy. This is a story about faith, resilience, and the costs of collision between cultures, and it helps us see why remembering these events still matters today. If you want more clear, carefully told histories like this, consider subscribing and staying with us. Introduction. When a northern Paiute spiritual leader named Wovoka began teaching a new ceremonial dance, it offered a vision that traveled quickly among tribes across the plains and plateaus. The ceremony promised restoration of family and land, the return of the buffalo, and the renewal of a way of life that had been eroded by disease, dispossession, and forced relocation. It carried both solace and urgency for communities confronting starvation and the breakdown of traditional social structures. People saw in it a pathway to cultural survival as much as a religious revival. The ceremony itself centered on a circular dance performed with rhythmic steps and songs meant to connect participants with ancestors and the spirit world. Wovoka's message combined elements drawn from his own Paiute background and from the Christian teachings he had encountered. He urged moral behavior, peaceful conduct, and communal ritual as means to bring about renewal. Many native leaders adapted the ceremony to their own traditions, creating a living, varied practice rather than a single uniform movement. Some participants wore what became known as ghost shirts, garments believed by adherents to offer spiritual protection during the ritual and in the face of violence. As the movement spread, its meanings multiplied. For Plains nations enduring broken treaties and crowded reservations, the dance was a statement of hope and cultural resilience. For federal authorities and settlers, it was often perceived as a potential threat. Officials banned gatherings, arrested practitioners, and sometimes moved to forcibly disperse ceremonies. Tensions rose in places like the northern reservations where leaders sought to maintain order, while their people embraced the dance as both comfort and resistance. The death of prominent figures during attempts to control unrest further escalated fear on all sides. The ceremony's rapid diffusion and the heavy-handed responses it elicited created a tragic intersection of spiritual aspiration and political suppression. Efforts to outlaw the dance and to punish its leaders fractured communities and ended large public gatherings, though elements of the practice and its memory persisted in family traditions and later cultural revitalization. For those who trace this history today, the movement stands as a testament to the power of faith under duress, and to the lengths that governments once went to in attempting to extinguish indigenous religious expression. If you found this account meaningful, consider subscribing for more historical perspectives. Origins of the ghost dance. When tribal communities across the Great Basin and the Plains were confronting the collapse of traditional lifeways, a new spiritual movement emerged from a northern Paiute prophet named Wovoka, also known as Jack Wilson. He described a vision in which the world would be renewed, ancestors would return, and the buffalo and other resources would be restored if people lived righteously and performed a ceremonial circle dance. This message combined familiar indigenous cosmologies with moral teachings that reflected contact with Christian missionaries, producing a form of spiritual revival that felt both immediate and transformative. Wovoka's teachings stressed moral behavior, peaceful conduct, and ritual renewal rather than violent resistance. He encouraged people to abstain from harmful habits and to take part in communal rites, promising that the dance itself would help bring about a restored world. The ritual was simple in form but powerful in effect: a communal circle dance, repetitive songs and prayers, and gatherings that fostered solidarity. Some communities developed distinctive regalia and songs that reflected local beliefs and aesthetics, so the practice looked different from one place to another even as its core promise remained consistent. The movement spread quickly through existing networks of trade, kinship, and travel among indigenous nations. Traveling leaders from the plains, including well-known Lakota figures, visited the Paiute country to learn the dance and the message, and then brought those ideas back to their own people. There the prophecy took on new inflections. On the plains it often resonated with a deep and desperate longing for the return of buffalo herds and for relief from disease, dispossession, and forced cultural change imposed on reservations. Local histories show how the ghost dance adapted. Some groups emphasized renewal and peace, while others incorporated stronger expectations about the displacement of outsiders. Beyond prophecy, the ghost dance functioned as a coping strategy and a mechanism for collective identity. It provided a ritual framework through which communities could express grief, hope, and communal resilience. Music, rhythm, and dress created a shared language that crossed tribal boundaries and allowed disparate peoples to imagine a common future. If you would like further explorations into these stories, please consider subscribing for more calm, careful looks at how spiritual movement shaped and was shaped by indigenous life. Spread of the movement. When a Paiute religious leader on the Walker River Reservation described a vision promising the restoration of native lifeways, the message did not stay local for long. Wovoka, also known as Jack Wilson, spoke in a language of renewal and ritual that resonated with communities facing cultural dislocation, loss of the buffalo, and relentless pressure from settler expansion. Word of his ghost dance spread outward on established networks, visiting delegations, kinship ties, intertribal councils, and the seasonal circuits where people met to trade, marry, and share news. Travel played a central role in the movement's rapid dispersion. Delegates from the plains traveled physically to Nevada and brought back the ceremony. Among them were Lakota leaders who learned the dance and its songs firsthand and then taught them to others on the plains. Railroads and stage routes increased contact between distant reservations, helping messages travel farther and faster than itinerant runners alone could manage. At the same time, forced relocations and the reservation system concentrated many tribes in closer proximity than before, creating new opportunities for ideas to cross cultural lines quickly. Local adaptation shaped how the dance was adopted. In the Great Basin, the ceremonies emphasized spiritual renewal and communal healing, while on the plains some groups fused ghost dance elements with older prophetic traditions and local ritual forms. The promise of returning game and departed ancestors found different expressions. Some communities focused on passive, patient waiting. Others incorporated more assertive rhetoric about reclaiming lands and dignity. Stories of protective garments and special songs spread alongside the dance steps, and each band or nation adjusted the ritual to fit language, cosmology, and social structure. Communication was not only face-to-face. Missionaries, Indian agents, and newspapers recorded and relayed accounts, often misunderstanding or sensationalizing what they observed. Reports in distant towns produced alarm among settlers and officials who read those dispatches as signs of a pan-Indian uprising rather than a spiritual revival. That misreading helped turn a spreading religious phenomenon into a political crisis, accelerating efforts to curb intertribal travel and suppress gatherings that had once been tolerated or ignored. Individual leaders and messengers mattered greatly. Persons such as Kicking Bear and Short Bull acted as cultural carriers, teaching songs, explaining meanings, and organizing communal dances across multiple bands. Women and youth also played key roles. They learned the dances, transmitted songs within families, and sustained the movement's daily rhythms. In many places, dances moved from small clusters of believers into larger communal ceremonies that drew participants from neighboring reservations and sometimes from multiple language groups. Suppression followed the spread. Authorities reacted by restricting travel, arresting prominent practitioners, and dispersing gatherings. Military patrols increased near reservations where the dance had taken hold. The combination of miscommunication, fear, and coercive policy interrupted the networks that had enabled rapid growth. Yet even after public suppression, the ceremonial elements persisted in private and in memory, influencing later revitalization efforts and continuing to shape intertribal religious life. If this overview helped you, consider subscribing for more calm, documented readings that explore the complex ways ideas travel and change. Fear and misunderstanding. When news of the ghost dance reached non-native communities, many observers interpreted spiritual renewal as a political threat. Officials in faraway bureaucracies and local settlers alike read the movement through a familiar frame. Native spiritual practice equated with potential rebellion. Misreading ceremonial intent as a call to arms drove a cascade of decisions that treated religious revival like insurrection. That lens of suspicion reshaped how policymakers, soldiers, missionaries, and journalists responded. Leaders inside and outside indigenous communities described the movement in different languages and with different priorities. The Paiute visionary who inspired the revival spoke about renewal, a return of the old ways, and hope for families and communities. Outside observers focused on ritual elements they did not understand: public dancing, prophetic language, and distinctive clothing. Some adherents wore specially worked garments that they believed protected them spiritually. To onlookers, those garments were reported as symbols of defiance. Rumors amplified details and obscured meaning. Newspapers printed breathless accounts that often left out context. Local Indian agents and military officers reacted to those reports with alarm. Misinterpretation hardened into policy very quickly. Practical consequences followed from that fear. Authorities instituted restrictions on meetings and ceremonies. Arrests and disarmament orders became common tools meant to prevent an uprising that officials feared was imminent. Visits by soldiers to disarm camps, attempts to detain leaders, and the policing of sacred gatherings created tense encounters. In at least one tragic confrontation, the combination of misunderstanding, panic, and heavy-handed intervention resulted in a violent suppression that destroyed lives and trust without resolving the underlying sources of anxiety. Communities were traumatized by the loss of autonomy and the outlawing of cultural expression. Religious practice suffered under the weight of suspicion and legal pressure, with many traditions pushed underground. Media framing played a critical role in turning spiritual revival into a security story. Sensational headlines and selective eyewitness accounts circulated widely and shaped public opinion. Correspondents unfamiliar with indigenous cosmologies and social networks explained rituals in militarized language. By the time officials read those dispatches, the contours of a crisis had already been drawn. Conversely, sympathetic commentators, often missionaries or advocates, frequently failed to convey the full spiritual significance of the movement, reducing complex beliefs to a series of mistaken gestures. The result was a mutual failure of interpretation. Indigenous people struggled to have their intentions heard, and non-Indigenous institutions defaulted to containment strategies. Lessons from those failures remain relevant today. Cultural literacy, respectful consultation with community leaders, and careful, contextual reporting can prevent small misunderstandings from becoming crises. Law enforcement and policymakers benefit from protocols that prioritize dialogue and de-escalation when confronting unfamiliar religious gatherings. Support for Indigenous-led education about spiritual traditions helps correct long-standing misperceptions. If coverage of these topics seems useful, consider subscribing for more calm documentary explorations that center historical nuance and contemporary relevance. Suppression by authorities. As the ghost dance spread across reservations, federal agents, local officials, and the press increasingly treated a spiritual revival as a public order crisis. Mainstream newspapers amplified fears by describing gatherings in alarmist terms, and some local authorities responded by forbidding the dances outright. Indian agents, charged with maintaining control on reservations, used administrative power to ban meetings, confiscate ritual items, and order arrests of prominent participants. Short Bull and Kicking Bear were among those detained and transported away from their communities to military custody at Fort Sheridan, a clear signal that civil authority would not tolerate what it perceived as unrest. Military force became part of the official response when civilian measures failed to suppress the movement. Troops were deployed to patrol reservation boundaries, oversee disarmament efforts, and escort detained individuals to distant posts. Bands attempting to relocate or to gather for ceremonies were sometimes intercepted and escorted under guard. The tension reached a tragic climax at Wounded Knee, where a deadly encounter effectively quelled visible public practice of the ghost dance and underscored how quickly spiritual expression could be met with lethal control. Administrative and legal mechanisms reinforced physical suppression. Indian agents leveraged existing federal regulations and local ordinances to criminalize dances and enforce curfews. Missionaries and boarding school officials, aligned with assimilationist policy, discouraged or forbade traditional ceremonies, eroding communal support for public practice. Surveillance of reservation life increased, and reports of troublemakers circulated through Indian service correspondence, justifying further intervention. Detention and transportation of leaders not only removed local organizers but also disrupted social cohesion and the transmission of cultural knowledge. The legacy of that suppression persisted for generations, shaping tribal government relations and fueling demands for religious freedom and redress. Efforts to restore rights came slowly. Legislative and judicial changes in the mid to late 20th century, including the American Indian Religious Freedom Act in 1978, worked to protect practices that had been outlawed or stigmatized. Today, many tribes continue cultural revitalization and memorialization projects, and historians and tribal scholars document the way state suppression fractured communities. If you would like more on Indigenous histories and their contemporary implications, consider subscribing for further episodes that explore these stories with care and accuracy. Connection to Wounded Knee. During the late 19th century, the ghost dance movement moved into Lakota country with a promise of renewal and an end to suffering, and its presence at Pine Ridge directly intersected with a chain of events that culminated at Wounded Knee. Tensions had been rising. Agents, settlers, and military officers read the ritual as a political threat rather than a spiritual revival. When a prominent Lakota leader was killed during an attempt to arrest him, groups of followers dispersed and sought refuge where the ghost dance gatherings were strongest, swelling camps and heightening the alarm among officials. Troops of the United States 7th Cavalry were dispatched to the reservation, ostensibly to keep order and disarm those considered dangerous. A routine attempt to disarm a band turned chaotic. Estimates of the Lakota dead vary, with numbers commonly given between 150 and 300, and many more wounded or displaced. The episode quickly became shorthand for the worst excesses of federal Indian policy. The scene that unfolded remains a stark example of how fear and miscommunication, fed by sensationalist press accounts and official paranoia, can produce sudden, devastating outcomes. Afterwards, the federal response was emphatic and punitive. Leaders associated with the ghost dance were rounded up, some were detained by the army and transported away from their homelands, and ceremonial objects were confiscated or destroyed under the pretext of public safety. The army awarded a number of medals of honor to soldiers present at the engagement, a fact that has since become part of ongoing debates and efforts by descendants and advocates to reassess official narratives and seek accountability. These measures, both symbolic and concrete, helped to dismantle the movement in the region and to justify stricter surveillance of native religious life. The long shadow of Wounded Knee shaped policy and collective memory. For Native communities, the event is not simply an isolated tragedy but a clear instance of how cultural and spiritual expression was criminalized and suppressed. Memorials at the site and in communities across the region serve as places of mourning and education, where descendants recount oral histories, preserve songs and prayers, and challenge reductive portrayals in mainstream history. Public interest in the episode has led to renewed scholarship, museum exhibits, and curriculum changes that foreground Indigenous perspectives and the peaceful teachings of the ghost dance prophet as central to understanding what happened. If you found this account useful, please consider subscribing for more calm, carefully sourced history and reflections. Legacy. During the late 19th century, a spiritual movement sparked by the teachings of Wovoka, also known as Jack Wilson, left an imprint that extends far beyond the ceremonies themselves, shaping how communities remember, resist, and reclaim. The movement's promise of renewal, carried into Lakota, Cheyenne, and other nations, became a touchstone for cultural identity. Oral histories preserve its songs and steps, while survivors' testimonies and later ethnographers recorded the meaning those ceremonies held for people facing dispossession. Rare material traces survive as well: clothing attributed to ghost dance adherents, recorded songs, and personal accounts in archives and museum collections offer concrete links to an intangible past. Government reaction to the movement produced a legacy of contested memory and policy that still matters today. Heightened military presence and attempts to outlaw gatherings created a climate of fear and surveillance on reservations, practices that subsequent scholars have tied to broader efforts at assimilation and control. Anthropologists such as James Mooney documented the movement from an outsider perspective, producing influential studies that shaped public understanding. At the same time, Indigenous voices and historians have reinterpreted those sources to emphasize resilience rather than mere desperation. Memorials, especially at sites where suppression culminated, serve as focal points for remembrance and education, and annual gatherings and commemorations maintain continuity between past and present. Cultural revitalization owes much to the movement's persistence as a symbol. Contemporary Native artists, musicians, poets, and dancers draw on ghost dance motifs to explore themes of renewal and memory, and the story is taught in university courses in Native studies, history, and anthropology as a case study in spiritual resistance. Works that entered popular awareness, like accounts by Lakota figures and their interpreters, have influenced literature and public history, prompting museums such as the National Museum of the American Indian and Regional Cultural Centers to collect, exhibit, and contextualize artifacts and narratives. These exhibitions help shift the conversation from a single event to a longer arc of survival, sovereignty, and healing. Politically, the memory of the movement has been invoked by later generations as a moral and rhetorical resource in struggles for rights and self-determination. Activists and community leaders reference those earlier calls for renewal when advocating for language programs, cultural education, and treaty rights, framing historical trauma alongside contemporary claims for justice. Scholarly reassessment continues to complicate earlier portrayals, centering Indigenous testimony and foregrounding agency. If you found this account illuminating, please consider subscribing for more concise documentary pieces that respect voices and sources. What began as a prayer for renewal became a flashpoint where hope and fear collided. The ghost dance movement started with Wovoka's vision of spiritual restoration and reunion, spread quickly across many nations as both a ceremony and a response to devastating loss, and was met by growing misunderstanding and alarm that led to arrests, military intervention, and tragedy at Wounded Knee. Yet its story is not only one of suppression, it is also a story of cultural resilience, memory, and the ongoing struggle for sovereignty and dignity. If this history resonated with you, Take a moment to reflect on the voices we heard and those still striving to be heard. Consider subscribing if you'd like more calm, careful explorations of underrepresented histories and the ways communities endure and rebuild. In future episodes, we will look deeper at other Indigenous movements, legal battles, and cultural revivals that continue to shape the present. Share your thoughts or family memories in the comments below. Your perspective helps keep these stories alive.